Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and welcome to this week's podcast, and it is a rather special event. As regular listeners know, I had the pleasure and the privilege of supervising Dr. Mike Kent for his PhD at Murdoch University. It changed my life, it changed the way I think about supervision. He's a remarkable human being, and while I was in the United Kingdom and he was in the United Kingdom, he came and delivered a fantastic seminar at the University of Bolton. So the podcast that you're about to hear is the record of that seminar, and I'll make sure the content is as clean as it can be in terms of sound, and also that I'm able to include and incorporate the questions as well. So I hope you enjoy it. It was a wonderful seminar, and Mike is a great speaker, and I thank him personally and professionally for that very special day and that very special visit that he gave us at the University of Bolton.
Welcome to our second research seminar of the semester, and I'm going to hand over to Tara Brabazon, Professor Tara Brabazon of New Media, etc., to introduce our guest speaker, Mike Kent. So, over to Tara.
Thank you, gorgeous David. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to you. Hello. Hello, darling. It's my great pleasure to introduce darling Dr. Mike Kent. He's a lecturer in Internet Studies at Curtin University in Western Australia. Mike completed his doctorate at Murdoch University. He explored particularly, as his supervisor, I know something about this topic, the relationship between the online environment and particularly post-colonial theory. So he was very interested in the relationship between not only online and offline environments, but justice and injustice, and how those new relationships are being formulated. He went on to teach in a range of humanities and social science disciplines in both Australia and in the United Kingdom. He was the key researcher at the National Centre for Art, Design and Media that was based at the University of Brighton. But Mike is becoming best known for his work that investigates impairment, disability and the role and function of new media in either mitigating or in fact making those injustices worse. And with Dr. Katie Ellis, he has published what I believe is really the book of the field, which is Disability and New Media, that was published by Routledge in 2011. So today he's really booting up, or rebooting indeed, Dr. Kent. The next strand of his research, and his paper for us today, as you can see, is Disability and E-Learning. Mike, we love having you here, and I love hearing this accent again. He's one of my people. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Mike Kent.
I often forget that I have an accent when I'm here, so yes, today I'd like to talk, I'm going to talk about a number of different little bits, because talking about disability and e-learning, you sort of have to talk about disability and e-learning and then put them together and think about it. So I want to talk specifically about e-learning and online education, which is going to be me saying this is what's happening in online education and giving you some stats which aren't particularly important, except to say that it's growing and it's an interesting field of sort of development, particularly in higher education, which is really my focus. We're going to look at disability, and particularly digital disability, and I want to talk a little bit about the work that I did with Katie Ellis in particular towards our book and exploring this sort of things. I then want to talk about e-learning and disability, because there's I'll show you a picture a bit later in the talk, but I recently went to the graduation ceremony at Curtin University for our Open University Australia students. Unlike the Open University here, OUA in Australia amalgamates a whole lot of different universities and sort of packages their units that can be taught fully online together, so students can put degrees together based on a whole lot of different institutions. It occurred to me then that I was meeting these students for the very first time face to face, and there's a whole lot of things about people's choice to disclose whether they have a particular impairment. One of the students was in a wheelchair. We didn't know. There were only 3 students. There was no reason for it. There was no reason for that to be an issue with this young woman's education. But it was nonetheless quite telling that as we lose some of our connection to our students, our ability to know as much about them and perhaps their needs also decreases, which can be great for the students in many cases. I'm then going to talk briefly about learning management systems, both Moodle, which I understand you use here, and Blackboard, which I'm burdened with at home. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that Katie and I have been working on now, looking at the concept of a broader digital campus. And this raises a whole lot of questions about where students are. Lots of fantastic advances in accessibility have taken place due to legal requirements. So in the 1998 adjustment to the Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act in the US meant a whole lot of changes happened, and that followed with WCAG 1.0. I'll talk about this more later, but, those things are important. But now we might be having responsibility. Perhaps it's more of a problem for me than perhaps some of you here, but in the future that may change, where if I'm teaching a student fully online and they happen to be in the United States and they're in a student set up Facebook informal learning setting, do I as an educator or does the university have moral or legal obligations to make sure that that's accessible and those sort of things? So I'm going to open up a little bit of a can of worms, which often terrifies particularly American university administrators. And then I'm going to talk about some other issues, which is just, I had a really fascinating discussion with Maria Sabati in London, and I thought I'd share some of that with you. So, e-learning and online education. You'll have to forgive me, I'm going to be reading off my PowerPoint slides. My notes are on a Virgin train somewhere between Manchester and London. But they basically said what I said here. So this is my favourite quote from Joseph Licklider, and it's my favourite because he said it in 1968. Computer communication technology will allow us, he said, to interact with the richness of living information, not merely in the passive way that we have become accustomed to using books and libraries, but as an active participant in an ongoing process, bringing something to it through our interaction with it, and not simply receiving something from it by our connection to it. And this is sort of a bit of a motherhood statement on why actually engaging students online is a really good idea. If that idea gets realised, now we do have things like the internet and the World Wide Web, which we didn't in 1968, that will hopefully greatly enhance student learning. Now, I think in the context here at Bolton, we're really going to be talking more about a blended learning environment, so what students are doing in accompanying their face-to-face learning, whereas I suppose I'm perhaps more engaged with fully online learning. I would say 3/4 of the students that I teach I never see. So that's quite different, but the issues in both are quite similar. And I just threw in that little reference there to Bertrand Williams. I've absolutely littered this presentation with references. That's not that's partly to show off because I've been reading a lot about this stuff and I thought I'd better share. But it's also, I thought the slides hopefully will act as a bit of a reference if you want to go back and say, oh, he did say something interesting. It was about a 25-minute mark and I'd forgotten what I was saying. So, okay. So what does online learning aim to achieve? You get, this is once again a silly selection of bullet points. It aims to achieve obviously a better educational outcome for the students, and if you're going to be brutally honest, it probably also engages a better deployment of staff time and resources as well. But it does involve things like greater flexibility for students. They don't have to be there in the same time and space as either you teaching them or their fellow students. It allows for better distribution of learning materials and sort of leveraging the existing infrastructure that our students have in their laptops and their internet connections. This Craig Wozak, Hyde and Byrne article is the most brave I've ever read. It said, yeah, we're teaching nursing at the University of Sydney and we don't have enough space to teach them, so we sort of had to put them all online. It's not an ideal thing to do, but I really admire the fact they actually came out and said it. But I mean, I think the real thing that you'd hope for is that you get that enhanced interaction that Licklider predicted through the sort of teacher and learner online interaction. These are those stats I was telling you about. It is a growing area. It's obvious the research that I found involved often interviewing university administrators, often in the United States, and they say, oh, yes, it's growing. So 31.3% of students take at least one online class. This is in the United States. The growth by 10% as opposed to 1% growth in all enrolments is significant. In my department now, I do teach the Internet Communications degree, so you'd sort of think it was biased towards that. But we've had a 300% growth in student numbers since 2009, and that's all online. So for us, it's a real, it's a very much growing area. I think that some of the perhaps structural problems with your Department of Immigration would probably limit some of that here in the United Kingdom, but nonetheless, that sort of growth, if that's fully online, you can also see how that would move over into a blended learning environment as well. There's also, interesting, there's a bit of kickback against this, so there's been reports of staff resistance to and lack of respect for sort of people learning online. And this is highlighted in the case where people are actually, in particular in cases where people are dealing with students who are actually involved in face-to-face teaching and learning activities. So it's almost that blended learning environment that seems to get less respect, which I think is unfortunate because I think it's actually really valuable in that context. This sort of starts to already link into the disability theme that I wanted to bring up. Some of the initial technology that enables this online learning or facilitates it was actually developed specifically with students with disability in mind. And I'm thinking particularly of the iLecture or Lectopia or whatever it used to be called before that was developed out of the University of Western Australia. And the interesting thing about that is, like much universal design, things that are designed to help people with a particular impairment or a particular disability actually are extremely useful to everyone and provide a sort of an affordance, I suppose, to a wider variety of both students and educators. Perry has predicted the decline of the more traditional face-to-face teaching in favour of courses moving online. And I have to say at this point, it's like in the last 18 months, large universities in America suddenly woke up and discovered, we could record lectures and put them online. And then we can run all these automated online tests, and then we can have thousands and thousands of students. Never thought of that before. It's a bit disappointing, really, but that is certainly one of the. It certainly makes it one of those sort of hot topics, I suppose. Okay, so that's the background a little bit on e-learning. Sorry, it's a bit broad, but I just want to set the scene a bit. So I want to talk about disability now. Roughly 20% of the people in the world are classed as having a disability, and it's growing. This is due to the fact that the world is getting older and also environmental factors. I think it's important to remember that actually we're all just kind of temporarily not with a disability. I've played basketball for 25 years and I spend a lot of time with a mobility impairment. As we get older, this is something that is, affects us all. The fact that I can zoom my computer screen on my desk is enormously valuable to me in a way that it probably wasn't 20 years ago. I in particular work within sort of a version. Is anyone here from disability studies? Okay, well, I'm going to say that I'm not 100% behind the social model of disability, so if you feel the need to kill me, could you wait until the end of the... Okay, good.
You've got Tom Shakespeare.
Okay.
We're Shakespeare fans who questions the whole model.
Okay, fantastic. The social model of disability, for those of you who may be less familiar with it, and this is the quote from Oliver, is I won't read through that quote, but it's the idea of separating the idea of a particular impairment with a disability. So a person may have a particular impairment, they might have trouble seeing, they might need to use a wheelchair to get around. That is not what causes them to have a disability. What happens is the way that we design our environment and our society causes that impairment to be a disability. And I've got to say, I'm massively impressed with the university campus here. My notes were saying, make the standard thing about us all having to track up stairs to get here. I mean, I did use the death lift, which was kind of scary. But this is a fantastically accessible campus, which I think, unfortunately, really makes it stand out, particularly here in the United Kingdom. So this idea that society is the problem, and that if we change society, we can people won't suffer disability; they will just have their impairments. My sort of problem with it is that some people will have impairments which still need to be acknowledged, and I think often the social model of disability is trying to go, no, if we just change society enough, everyone will be fine. And some people live with chronic pain. Pretending that is going to go away is not, I think, is not necessarily as productive as perhaps it once was. I understand the social model of disability was very much a political construction, sort of in that whole let's get a whole lot of disabled people together and fight injustice, which I think is totally admirable, but it does have some problems with the model, and I think that's the primary one. And the secondary one is that it tends to gloss over a lot of people with mental impairments. The idea that I have the classic is my mind is just as good as yours, and that's pretty mean if someone's mind isn't quite as good as theirs. So rant on about that so much, but yes. So you heard?
No, I was just noting that you've cited yourself. That's
I have cited myself. No, in fact, I haven't. I've cited Katie.
Yeah.
I just happen to be the name behind hers. In fact, it's worse. I've quoted myself, but it's a great quote. Once a piece of information or content is digitised, its form is significantly transformed. Whereas a work written on a page is locked in that format, so an analogue format, once a word is a digital file, it can be transformed to suit any person trying to access it. It can appear as the written word, it can be automatically translated into another language, it can be interpreted as an image, or it can be shown in sign language, and it can be displayed on a braille tablet. I'm not sure if displayed is the right word. Once the file is connected to the internet, all these different modes of access can take place simultaneously all over the world. The information can be requested through traditional keyboard, by speech, through eye tracking software, or by moving any number of different mouse devices. Now, that all sounds a little bit utopian, and it kind of is. Making all that content inaccessible, though, is a choice, but the critical bit is making it inaccessible is also a choice. Not often a particularly well thought out choice, but a choice that could have been avoided. I just want to sort of segue a bit here in talking about Fiona Campbell-Curry's sort of concept of ableism, that it's a network of beliefs, processes and practices that produce a particular kind of self and body, so the corporeal standard, that is projected as the perfect, species-typical and therefore essentially fully human. Disability then is a diminished state of human being. So Fiona's idea is that ableism should be considered a bit like sexism or racism. So this is how she's constructed it. So here's an example of digital ableism. Capture. I have a hate-hate relationship with capture. Capture is the little stupid warped picture of words that you have to type in to prove that you're not a machine. And this is sort of the theory behind it from Dr. Malik. Abilities like vision are the result of billions of years of evolution and difficult for us to understand by introspection, whereas abilities like multiplying two numbers are things we were implicitly taught and can readily express in a computer program. This is a very prejudiced version of that evolution and what its outcome was supposed to be. There are lots of people who can't read capture, and that does not make them less human, or the fact that they are they are still not a computer perhaps can be determined in some other way. And this has been an ongoing thing. I mean, this is back from 2007, but Jared Goggin has been certainly active in this for the last decade and more. If there is much more acceptance of disability as a social rather than a purely medical phenomenon, and greater public support for the removal of barriers and for an end to discrimination and exclusion of people with disabilities, why are information technologies, often the newest and most heralded ones, still disabling? And in fact, very often disabling. So disability online is activated differently. That society causing disability or the things in society that cause an impairment to become a disability change once you're online. I'll talk more about how it's activated differently online. Things that, for example, my student from the graduation ceremony, I don't feel that the fact that she was using a wheelchair really impacted on her ability to use the internet or, in fact, most communications technology. It certainly impacts on the rest of her life, but it doesn't, in effect, become a digital disability. I suppose it does if she has to lift her computer up a flight of stairs or something like that. Whereas, for example, I'm dyslexic. If you ever have to get in a live chat with me, you'll go, oh, God, this man actually writes for a living. How on earth does he manage that? There's 1 in 4 words that's spelt correct, and you know that was just a fluke. So that fact that when I'm typing raw words into a computer rather than having a nice spell check and make it okay for me really impacts on my ability to interact with people online. Not in a way that I particularly mind, but perhaps other people find it disturbing. Similarly, all manner of print impairments, so people with vision impairments, people with dexterity issues that prevent them using a keyboard or a mouse properly, and increasingly people who have trouble with audio files as audio becomes a much more important part of the internet and the way we use it, particularly through YouTube. And it was only recently that YouTube really enabled us to put captions on YouTube videos. If you upload a YouTube video directly to Facebook, you can't put captions on it. So there's those disabling bad decisions. Okay, I'll stop ranting and move. This, I'm quoting myself again, this is the sort of model that Katie and I developed about the development of internet-based technologies. And when I say model, that makes me sound like it's one of those physics or engineering models that works all the time. It's not. It's one of those sort of cultural studies models, which is more prone to interpretation. So sometimes you sort of need to squint and look at it sideways for it to work. But nonetheless, this sadly seems to hold true, that often when a technology is first developed, it is accessible to the people who are developing it, often because they are computer programmers, and if you are blind in a computer programmer, you often have quite a bit of accessibility stuff set up to make sure you can access your own code. But this is often not widely distributed in the community. Then we often move to things where something is no longer accessible and widely distributed. When you're first putting together a social networking site and you're using Usenet or something like that, it's quite accessible. As soon as it becomes Facebook, Facebook was famously inaccessible. And then we have this sort of band-aid where it becomes widely distributed and accessible as something becomes important enough that people complain enough about it that it has to be changed. And Facebook is a classic example of this. Now, I'm going to talk more about this in relation to the learning management systems, but the important thing with this is that band-aid, making something retrospectively accessible, a couple of big words there, only works when you still have control of the product. So if you are Facebook, you can change Facebook to be something radically different overnight because you have complete control over Facebook. If you're MySpace, you can't, because everyone's customised their own web page. And the fact that they've set them up so that they play music and they don't work with screen readers and they have flashing lights so they can bring on seizures, that's something you can turn it off, but you can't then retrospectively put this accessibility on. So there's sort of a limit to how this works. So we would hope that they would evolve instead, that things are accessible from the beginning through sort of implementation of universal design principles. And all my internet communications graduates leaving my first year unit so terrified of making things inaccessible because I've told them off about it, even though they haven't done anything wrong yet, that they won't let that happen. There is another alternative. Now, this is very much following, I suppose, the social model of disability. We have another alternative when we're dealing with online platforms, and that is to have to keep that information not locked in any format. So that word that I've typed into a computer is just a series of zeros and ones. That can be interpreted in a whole lot of different devices, so we can engage in a bit of mass customization, so everyone can see things or can access a particular bit of information the way that they're most comfortable with. Now, I've interspersed a few of these quotes, but it talks about how there's a potential as we use IT more and more, if we don't make sure that it's accessible, that rather than becoming something particularly useful for people with different impairments and something that empowers them, it in fact adds in a new layer of disadvantage. And if we're doing that, it's really sad. I mean, it's okay that the London Underground was built with all these steps on. People probably weren't thinking about accessibility for people with wheelchairs when they were doing it. Now we do. It would be terrible if it was built again tomorrow and all those same inaccessibility features were still there. Okay, so I've talked about disability. Now I'm going to talk a little about e-learning and disability. About somewhere between 8 and 14% of people in the US and here in the UK who are in higher education have a disability. And that's compared with 18% of the working population. Now, these stats don't compare directly, but in Australia it's closer to 4%. Now, I think that is coming from the 4% comes from self-reporting to the university. So it doesn't, hopefully it's not as terrible as it looks, but it might be as terrible as it looks. And there are certainly problems for people with disabilities for accessing online education. People with disability are less likely to have access to information technology. Now, that tends to be a feature of the fact that people with a disability tend to have lower incomes, and lower incomes tend to mean less information technology. So that, when I was talking before about using the infrastructure of your students at home as a way of them communicating with you and with each other, that infrastructure has to be at home, and it has to be of a sufficient quality. And there's been a number of, there are a number of problems, and this is often related. This is not in every case, but people do have problems finding the accessibility of websites and course learning management systems, the accessibility of digital audio and video files. And I'm terrible for this. I always give my students audio feedback. I record a little MP3 for their essays, and I always send out the email saying, please let me know, I'm very happy to give you written feedback instead. And no one ever does, ever. And that really worries me. So there's also flexible time limits built into online exams, PowerPoint and data projections during lectures. I'm sorry that all my slides are bland. That is quite deliberate because I'd like screen readers to be able to use them, so you don't have all these flipping things, and it just makes my presentations less exciting. Sorry. Also, course materials in PDFs. There's nothing better than having a nice, clean, accessible HTML file that someone thinks would be better if they emailed it out as an inaccessible PDF. Someone's gone to effort to make it inaccessible. And also lack of needed adaptive technology. If you actually are going to use a Braille tablet, you're going to need to stump up with $5,000, which it used to be less pounds than it is now. Anyway, okay. There's also problems with chat rooms, compatibility with screen readers for people with vision impairments. This is once again dependent on the sort of chat room you're using and that sort of thing, but these things do exist. And it's more. I'm sort of listing these more as these are things to consider when you're setting up your e-learning environment or when you're maintaining it. There's also this is an interesting study by Crittenden and Roberts. The online courses are not necessarily designed with accessibility in mind, and this can often mean when you have a student who then comes and discloses that they have a disability, and you have a moral and a legal responsibility to make your course accessible, that you need to redesign it to ensure that it is then accessible, which is a real pain, particularly if it's only for one or two students. But the ease of design to make it accessible in the first place is not that hard, and it's often just a matter of digital and accessibility literacy on the part of the person who's designing it. They also note that that this cause it is a hassle, and what it also worries me. This is exactly how we operate at Curtin University. Our department, if the students go through our disability office, they'll come to us. And they'll come to us with a pile of money saying, well, we'll pay someone to transcribe all this information. We have this fantastic new version of iLecture, which has these magnificent features. Some of them are terrible, but some of them are magnificent. One of them is it breaks the iLecture up into a visual display so the students can click on a particular lecture slide from a PowerPoint presentation. It goes straight to there, and the recording. They also have stuff where the students can leave comments on bits of the recording. I don't let them do that, but they can. There's also the option for the whole lecture to be transcribed, and then that text of the lecture becomes searchable. So any student can search for a particular phrase in a lecture and it will take them straight there. The only problem is it costs about $100 per lecture to have the transcription take place. I suspect it's done somewhere like Bangladesh, I'm not sure. The university will only do that if we have a student with a disability in the course, or identify them as a student with a disability in the course. So we sort of miss out on this accessibility function because of the way we've set it up, so that we only do things reactively rather than proactively. This is the other important thing, of course, is that the study that I was referring to, they found that students generally don't disclose that they have a disability. So I don't get those emails back saying, can I have that written feedback rather than audio feedback? And of course, they don't say this, but it's also a problem. If you have actually designed stuff properly, your students then don't have to disclose, and that is actually a better outcome for your students anyway. I mean, they might want to be sort of, an out and proud deaf activist or something like that, but they shouldn't have to be. That should be a choice that they get to make, not one that we force on them. So, I'll talk a little bit about identity. The most striking aspect of online communications for people with disabilities is the ability it affords the user to hide aspects of him or herself. For people with disability, online communication may allow the removal of their disability from the forefront of the interaction. Unlike communication in the offline world, where the stigma of disability or one's impairments itself may at times prevent one from venturing into the world freely and interacting with others, online communication allows the individual with the disability to encounter and to interact with others to a degree that they may not be possible offline. Now, this is back in 2004, 2005, and subsequently we've done some studying, and I think we actually carry a lot more baggage of our analogue bodies into digital interactions with people. But nonetheless, it's a good point that people don't have to disclose as much. And obviously, going back to the example about my dyslexia before, different impairments have different disclosure requirements. This is my students who are graduating. I'm very proud of them. It's a terrible photo of me. But and I think it's quite appropriate that you can't quite see Tessa's wheelchair sitting down there in the front. But this was the first time any of us realised that she was in a wheelchair. And fortunately, we managed to find the lifts at the graduation ceremony that took her up to the appropriate place for her to be, which was bad on Curtin University's behalf. But I just sort of wanted to make the point. This was really the three on the left are all the people, all the academics. That's Claire Lloyd and Matthew Allen, and then the three on the. For a horrible moment, I thought I'd been flipped around. On the right are our students graduating. So that's the first time we've met them. And there's actually a whole lot of them we'll never meet because most of them study on the East Coast and coming to Perth on the West Coast is a long way to travel for your graduation, so lots don't. So there is that sort of vanishing student and also that danger that once students with disability vanish online, people stop thinking about people with disability. They lose that prominence. And as so many of these problems are caused by the fact that we're not thinking about it to start with, thinking about different impairments and how it might impact on people vanishing away online is not a good thing. Disability access needs to be built into the design process and not retrofitted. And ideally, when we're providing resources for staff and tutors, we would hope that our templates are accessible to start with, and that accessibility is explained to people, particularly in the online environment. So that's going back to my Curtin transcripts, how annoying it is. So e-learning, that's some bad sides. On the upside, it can be really useful. Now this is a couple of studies related to iLecture from UWA. That idea that the fact that they could record lectures and students could, sounding like I'm getting all businessy, they could consume the lectures, not in the lecture theatre at a time of their choosing, has an enormous range of benefits. It means that if you can't access the campus or you can't access the campus easily, you can still access the lecture material. It means that if you have particular I was going to say mental illness, and it sounds such a horrible word, but I'm trying to be good with my impairment or disability. But if that induces behavioural issues which make it hard for you to be in a room full of people for a long period of time, you can sit and have the lecture effectively customised too. If you can't sit for more than 10 minutes, and we have 3-hour lectures at Curtin University. I hope none of you have those 3-hour lectures here.
Yeah, just done one. Yeah.
I mean, 3-hour lectures are a wonderful pedagogical tool, and I'm sure they're fantastic. If you have trouble sitting in one place for a long period of time, obviously, this allows you to break it down much more easily. This is just some more stats basically on that a second study by Williams. So 65% of students with disability found the lecture recording system essential. 32% said useful. So obviously they're getting some pretty good-looking stats. I think that's why they keep getting funding to upgrade the Electopia system. And this is the other crucial thing. 27% of students without a learning disability also found that recording lectures was particularly useful. So you do get that kickback when you're making particular things accessible for people with different impairments. Most often it helps other people as well. If you have a book which you then is transcribed into words, which increasingly now just means you tell your iPhone to do it for you, but it means that students can suddenly listen to their reading material while they're on the bus or jogging or whatever, which they probably didn't have access to previously. E-learning can also promote inclusion. Students who are unable to attend class, students with print impairments who are able to access course notes and handouts made available digitally without assistance. So if you have to have your course notes read to you, this is a way of continuing to access that. And it's good to see such extensive collaborative research in this field. I don't think there's any papers published that don't have 5 or 6 authors. In fact, there are particular 5 or 6 authors who have published one study 5 or 6 times with 5 or 6 different lead auditors, which is really annoying because they keep having slightly different but really interesting titles, and you go, oh, it's this gang again, great. So they've been haunting me for the last couple of weeks. Distance online education can also be attractive to people with disability, especially those with, as I said, mental health problems or learning disability like dyslexia. So the online learning, and this is, I'm talking often in terms of disclosure, that's obviously going to be much more related to fully online rather than blended online learning. So if you don't want to disclose as someone with a disability, it does. I mean, there are certain impairments where a blended environment really does help, because you'll be able to access course materials in ways that you couldn't otherwise. But generally, the advantages of or the affordance of not having to make a disclosure of being a person with a particular impairment is more in play with a fully online learning. But the accessibility and the flexibility are obviously intimately tied up in both forms of online or e-learning. Right, now I'd like to talk a little bit about specific learning management systems. I'm going to use Moodle and Blackboard. The stats show that Moodle and Blackboard are overwhelmingly, well, Blackboard has a habit of buying its main competitors. So the Blackboard group of learning management systems, which is Angel, Blackboard and WebCT, up until recently were seen as the massive market leaders, and Moodle was sort of the number two, I suppose. Lots of those stats that come out of the United States. So I'm not sure. My impression is that Moodle totally dominates here in the United Kingdom. Which quite rightly it should. Moodle is the Modular Object-Oriented Dynamic Learning Environment. Originally it was Martin's Object-Oriented Dynamic Learning Environment. It roughly, and this is sort of Wikipedia-ish articles, it's like, my students are here. It's obviously used by lots of people. It was developed by one of our PhD candidates at Curtin University, which, well, some of us are very proud of and other people don't talk about. Martin was very keen to develop it, and his whole research was based on developing an open source online learning management system, and Curtin decided that it would be much better if they were able to commercialise it, not quite getting that open source thing. So Martin took his Moodle and went home, and they don't talk anymore. But the Moodle is based in Perth, and they continue to work on it there, so we can be very grateful for that, and I can just be a little bit ashamed of my university for not embracing it. And in fact, we now, for our sins, have to use Blackboard, which I think is quite fun. This was released in 2002, so he's releasing his open source at the end of the .com bust as well. So it probably wasn't the most the most opportune time to be launching this, but it is obviously gone on to be a very successful learning management system. Now, there's real problems with Moodle, and I hate to use the analogy, but it's a bit MySpace-ish rather than Facebook-ish. So there are lots of accessibility modules available, but they tend to not be used. The code, which is all fairly unadulterated HTML code, should all be very accessible to screen readers, and it is. So if you are using, I'm going to use screen readers a lot in talking about print impairment, particularly for these learning management systems, because often it's people with vision impairments that really struggle with them. But you should, you can tab between each of the links in Moodle. The problem is that when people set up a Moodle site, often they're not thinking about this. So you end up with this version of accessibility which is technically accessible, but for all intents and purposes completely inaccessible. Yes, I could get my screen reader to go through every one of those tabs until I found the one I wanted, but there's 94 of them, and I have to go through 94 before I get to week one's readings. That's not going to work. So there's this problem with what is considered to be, accessibility isn't just ticking boxes, and in fact often giving people boxes to tick is the worst thing you can do. This technical accessibility was a common feature of the web, particularly following the update to Section 508 of the United States Rehabilitation Act in 1998. People, and I'm going to talk about that next. Yes, people desperate to comply with this Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is one of the main laws in America, forcing people who deal with the federal government to have accessible websites. When that came through, that people decided they could comply with this by complying with the WCAG 1.0, which came out in 1999, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That meant that, WCAG 1.1 said if you have an image, you need to have alternative text so someone can see what it is. And often what that meant, and Asakawa there highlights this, was that you would have an image and then you'd have a shadow behind it, and then you'd have alt text going, this is the shadow behind that other image. So if you're trying to listen to your screen tell you all this rubbish, it's in fact making it less accessible, not more accessible. But when you run it through your WCAG testing machine, it goes, oh, awesome, alt text for all images. So that was a real problem. So this is WCAG 1.0, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with and can recite. And as you can see, it's very much a developer's tool. If you want to have a level A WCAG classification, you must satisfy the requirements, otherwise it's impossible. If you want AA, then it should satisfy a number of other requirements, AAA, some other requirements. These requirements were very technical. They tried to make them not technical, but in 1999, not being technical meant that they expected it to work with Internet Explorer and Netscape Navigator, not that they were looking to the future. This was changed only 10 years later, in 2009 with WCAG 2, and as you can see, this is a much more open-ended idea, so things need to be perceivable, operable, understandable and robust. Under that, you don't get any points at all for giving out text to your shadow of your image. And this is, I suppose, the point they were trying to deal with. So Moodle suffers a bit in that everyone gets to customise it in their own way. And once you're using it, Moodle can't come back and change it. So the onus becomes on the end user, and depending on how far away your end user is removed from any sort of central authority, the guarantee of an institution, for example, to make sure that all their online learning is accessible is obviously limited. And this is going to lead me to say something good about Blackboard, and I'm really sorry. Blackboard Inc. was formed in 1997. In 2006, it purchased WebCT, which was its main competitor. Blackboard and WebCT seem to have that ability to be adopted by people by having excellent sales teams rather than necessarily being the best product. I'm fairly sure that, for example, the discussion boards on Blackboard are legacy from 1997 rather than anything that has been developed in in this century. And it's encouraged me to actually abandon it, and now I'm teaching all my courses using Facebook, which is... So in 2010, according to the Instructional Technology Council, they had about half the learning management system. If you drill down into those figures, what they mean is half of all community colleges used Blackboard. But it was a very volatile market at that stage, and I think its numbers have really... been hurt quite a lot since then, and certainly they've been, I suspect, hurt more by the contraction of the higher education sector budget. However, in 2010, it was awarded the Non-Visual Accessibility Gold certification by the National Federation of the Blind. Now, I was really excited when that happened until I realised that it had taken until 2010 before any learning management system anywhere had been awarded this certification, which you sort of think would be, if you don't have it, you're not even going to open the box and look at it. But this was the first time this has happened, and I think this came as due to pressure from the university customers that if they kept not being accessible, they were going to have to change platforms or be sued by people. So this top-down control of those platforms, the fact that they do release new versions of Blackboard and universities then go and buy and upgrade it, means that you can retrofit that accessibility in a way that I think Moodle struggles a bit with. And I mean, it's not that Moodle's trying to retrofit its accessibility, it's just that it needs people... You don't open the box with Moodle and get the accessible version. You have to make sure that it's accessible yourself. There's also some talk about, which I was interested in, but isn't related to this talk as much, but I slipped the slide in because I couldn't help myself, about some of the Western cultural bias that is evident in the use of Blackboard and WebCT, and how that, particularly if you're teaching as when you're fully online and your international cohort of students is still at home rather than coming to visit your university, these sort of issues I think are going to become more prevalent. Cooper and Heath had an interesting study in 2009. They critiqued the one-size-fits-all approach to accessibility in e-learning, and particularly gave WCAG 1.0 a hard time about it. And they also suggested this sort of pull effect from users to accessibility that you sort of get by looking at WCAG 2.0. It's not a case of, did I tick all the boxes? It's a case of, my students need to find this perceivable, operative, robust, and missed you. Anyway, you all know what I'm talking about. You can go back and look at my slides. Sorry, recording. Okay, now, I won't keep talking for much longer. I know that I've been talking for quite a while, and it's I noticed the longer I talk, the more monotone I tend to get, and the less interesting I find myself. But this stuff's interesting, so I'm going to talk about it anyway. Once we get the other thing to consider, and this is even more prevalent when you're talking about a blended learning environment, is that often you're not dealing with learning management systems. So we're talking about when we post as a reading for a week a YouTube video. Does the YouTube video have subtitles? Is it available as a text? If it doesn't, is this going to disadvantage your students? I can concede that if you have a class of 7 people and you know that they are all able to access that material and it's very convenient, having to get someone to transcribe it and put in the subtitles isn't necessarily efficient. If you've got 400 students, perhaps you should start assuming that some people are going to need it and that all students would benefit from it. There's also the use of visuals that don't have an alternative text description, or external links that we often post online to sites that are then not usable with adaptive technologies. I use a lot of these social networks in my own teaching, and certainly in my department's teaching. Fortunately, Facebook has now, as I said, been retrofitted. It's actually really quite an accessible platform. Otherwise, I wouldn't be using it with my students. Inevitably, I'll have one student who's in China and they can't access Facebook, which I find intensely annoying, but it's not the student's fault. Twitter is something that we use a lot to communicate with our students very directly, even just things like remember your assignments due tomorrow. Twitter is, ironically, a highly inaccessible platform. Twitter, even though it's a 140-character message, the Twitter website itself can't be used with a screen reader, which is ridiculous. And Twitter used to have an open API, an application programming interface, I remembered. I always forget what API stands for, only when I'm talking about it, but in this case I remember to. Yay. There is Easy Tweet, which is an accessible version of Twitter, which I always recommend to my students because we're using Twitter. But it's this sort of casual exclusion, which I think is a worry, and particularly, as I say, in a blended learning environment, but also obviously in my case as well. Similarly, if you're using virtual worlds, when you take students on excursions to Second Life, that can be very daunting, particularly if they're vision or hearing impaired. Google Plus this is funny. I've included Google Plus just because it's having some troubles with the deaf community, with its chat room. The person who's talking gets the big screen, but if you're using sign language, obviously you're not talking, so you don't get the big screen. They're actually working to fix that. And I included MySpace because I gave a lecture last week talking about how MySpace was inaccessible and then it died, and during the lecture it relaunched while I was talking. So I've mentioned it just in case. Boudreau in 2011 spoke of lots of these social networking sites and their accessibility and suggested, could they do worse if they tried? Although these things are more accessible, inevitably when you go to Blogger, they'll ask you to use a CAPTCHA to sign up. And CAPTCHA, as I said, is my pet hate, that just is that gatekeeper to inaccessibility. And then people go, it's okay, they've got audio capture as well. So now we're only excluding the people who are blind and deaf and needing a braille tablet. It's such a pathetic little technology that something else could do better so much more easily and just shows up everywhere. If you really want to prove someone's a human, ask them whether a fish or an elephant is bigger. There are a lot of easier ways to answer these questions, to answer that question of what is human, which includes a lot more people who are human than using things like that. The final point I'm going to make, you'll be glad to know, is the broader digital campus, and this impacts for blended learning as well. Students also make use of these social networks and Web 2.0 tools, not just when I'm teaching and learning. They go off and do it on their own. If you want to see an incredible example of that, go and look at the Uni Coffee Shop Facebook group. That is where all our Open University Australia students gather and they talk and they exchange notes, and they are overtly trying to recreate that social capital that students on campus get by going to the coffee shop, by going to the tavern, by meeting people in classes and clubs and whatever else it is they're doing, and then having access to those informal social networks of knowledge. I don't know, is Mike really tough on assignment deadlines, yes or no? They ask those questions there. And slack. Well, because I really care about my students who are off campus. No, the Open University students all have things like 5 young children and jobs, and they've run out of prescription of their drugs all the time. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. Okay, I've obviously been talking for too long. So there is this broader digital campus, and they're using these same platforms. The universities are also using social media to connect with their current and potential students, and there's all that data coming out of America about students selecting the college they go to based on its presence on Facebook and things like that, which, while on one level sort of is potentially kind of tragic, on another level it's happening and it's important. So the question I'm concerned about is who's responsible for accessibility in these informal settings. So just as if you have all your coffee shops up a flight of stairs, therefore your students in wheelchairs can't get to them and miss out on that informal space, that's a problem. What happens when your students can't access the social networking site that all your students are talking about the course on? And it's a legal and moral responsibility. I mean, I'm more concerned about the moral responsibility, but increasingly this is going to become a legal issue as well. Perhaps we're fortunate here in the UK and in Australia, but in America it's going to be a real... I suspect it's the next terrifying thing for university administrators. Similarly, as students, especially fully online students, are involved in the teaching and learning process, often they're not in the same jurisdiction as the university. So my students who might be in the United States potentially have recourse to the 508 section of the Rehabilitation Act, whereas I wouldn't have to deal with that as an Australian academic, or would I? So we have these issues that, as sort of each university itself becomes a globalised entity, we haven't really got our heads around yet. And there were some other issues that I wanted to consider, which I was going to talk briefly about mobile learning and smartphones and people with disability, not because I have anything particularly exciting to say about it just yet, but because it's something that is coming. I don't know if there's a Moodle iPhone app, but there is a Blackboard iPhone app. It's terrible, but it's there. And also, I think that another area that there's enormous but unexplored potential is using e-learning, both blended and fully online environments, to make higher education more accessible for people with mental health issues. And I think that's something that is still very much underdeveloped and is an area that not only could be exploited but really should be moved into, because I think it's something that is perhaps underdone at the moment. Cool.
How are you going, David? You happy? You want me to do questions?
Yeah.
Do you want to? You sure?
These are my references in case you want to follow any of those people I referred to obtusely up, and that's my comment.
His supervisor was an historian. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now question time. Are you happy to take questions?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And could you please give your name first, because we are having a rather large audience outside of this for the podcast as well. So who would like to ask the first question?
I'm David Rudd, Professor of something here at University of Bolton. Mike, thoroughly enjoyed that. Lots of stuff I'd like to follow up. I'm just interested in the bit you didn't talk about, Western bias in things like Blackboard. Yeah. I was wondering what sorts of things that it consisted of.
I think it's the assumptions about teaching and learning and the way that students... that study, I think, is talking about the idea that we're trying to get a discussion board to recreate what we imagine a tutorial at Oxbridge might have been 50 years ago. And that is not necessarily, it's not necessarily, in my opinion, something that translates to any teaching and learning environment, but particularly it's more alien perhaps if you're in China and used to a different style of learning. So that's a very short answer to a very big question.
My name's Mark Johnson from the Institute of Educational Cybernetics here. I have a question which is following up on that, I think, really, which is that this agenda of disability, which I think deep down it's related to sort of issues of capability. If you think about Amartya Sen and people like that, and there's a much deeper sort of economic and social critique there. It can be taken at a number of levels, can't it? It can be taken at a very superficial level, which is almost, since we're existing in this very commercialised, marketised education system, we have to make our education accessible so that we can attract more customers. So, for example, I've just been teaching a class where there's a deaf student, and the deaf student has 2 support assistants. It's fantastic, absolutely fantastic. But you have to ask, well, what happens afterwards? You know, he'll get his degree, but what happens afterwards? Is that support going to continue, or is it just there for the benefit of actually consuming this particular product?
Look, that is an excellent question. And partly I would imagine that some of the, for example, the standard lecture format is the reason you need that sort of adaptive technology effectively by having 2 translators is because you're not giving the whole lecture in sign language, which you could do. I mean, I've went to a conference last year in Warsaw, and the person presented in Polish sign, which was then translated into Polish, and then some people down the back translated it into English for our earphones for those of us who couldn't read any sign language. So, if your student only spoke Italian and had to have it translated, it would be a similar thing. But I think that's me dodging your question by redefining sign language as sort of the adaptive technology. There are, I agree, other areas where if we go out of our way to present higher education to people who have trouble consuming it, they then go into employers who then insist on that same thing, that same mode of communication, and they don't have that adaptive technology, it is going to be a problem. However, I don't think they necessarily have to do that. I mean, unless your student is going to be someone whose job becomes attending seminars, then there's the skills that they're learning, and both the immediately deployable skills and also the sort of broader, here's some knowledge, I'm going to sort of mess around with it and then I'm going to spit it out in a really interesting way sort of skills that we hope that everyone gets from university. So I'm hoping that people with disability have a better access to the workforce. But if they don't have the education at university first, then that access second is another whole hurdle away.
The problem is precisely what David's alluding to, which is we have a system which has been designed by the able-bodied, the Western largely, and we're doing some very strange things to it at the moment. And there are a lot of people who've been excluded from that history that are being brought into it. It doesn't fit them. And maybe we need some sort of participatory design. We need to really think about what we're doing with this thing.
Part of those transformations are this addition of blended and fully online learning, and the additional pressures being placed on universities through cuts to their budget and through demand of the greater demand of students. And when I say greater demand of students, I fantasise about the day when all our students would have come from wealthy upper class families, and we could say, you have to be at class whenever the hell we say because we know you don't have anything else to do in your life. They are not the students we're dealing with anymore. And increasingly I'm teaching people who are my own age, who are retraining, and this is a particular feature, I suppose, of people who are learning fully online, is that if you have young children and a job, this is the only way you're going to be able to study at university. And those changes and those transformations, I think, are a real opportunity to take the university, which was predicated on a particular type of person and student and institution, and keep the benefits that the university can provide to our students, but provide them to different people in different ways.
David Kitchener. One interesting thing about your presentation, Mike, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, so what I'm going to say is not a criticism, it's a comment, is that it struck me that many of your approaches actually did reflect the social model in the way you were approaching things, which is fine. And the second thing is that I'd take it one stage further, is that you use the word disabled. Well, disaffected, disheartened, disenchanted. The prefix disabled, is negative. And I would argue that rather than being proactive and thinking about how we should accommodate people with a designated disability, we should just think about learners and ignore the fact, this whole concept, the paradigm of disability, and say, no, it doesn't exist. What actually exists is people being unable to access learning. And I'd argue that on an inclusive model, having categories of mental health or disability is unhelpful. There are learners, and I think this is one small piece of a jigsaw of a whole new way of approaching curriculum design of engagement. And I work with OU, and I know how proactive they can be. So, just a comment, not a criticism, but it's a philosophical side of it.
I'm glad you made it, because I disagree with you. I think that that's the ideal, but I find often I spend my life just shouting at people to make simple decisions. Press A instead of B, because A will make everything work and B will shut it down for this whole group of people we haven't thought of. So that labelling serves my purposes enormously, because I can say, this is what I'm talking about. Although I want everything to be inclusive, I want you to think, when you're being inclusive, about people who have vision impairment. And I'm labelling, I'm calling them out, because so often I see mistakes that are made just because that wasn't thought of. So I do agree with what you're saying, and I totally do a lot of social model stuff. It's just I slightly deviate, and some people in England get very excited about that. But yeah, I think that there is that certain there's that need to make change, and change currently requires pejorative labels, which I don't necessarily like, but I feel are very useful.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book Digital Vertigo. It's from, I think it's called Stephen Keen or something. He's Andrew Keen. Yes, it's interesting because he mentions in there that nowadays society expects. Well, no expects. He says society, everybody in society, put things online to share every aspect of the personal life and professional life. But not only that, it's expected that you share that online. So when you go to apply for jobs, the first thing that job employers go online to see and Google you, to find you somewhere. And that's an issue with people with special needs, because obviously there are, like you were mentioning, the sites that are not accessible for them, and LinkedIn and all these areas that they go for, and they cross you as a able person to pursue a job. So I was wondering, what's your experience in these kind of approaches, and if you have done any research about what that side of the society, we're not talking about being a student, it's employability as well.
It's a really good point. One of my favourite stories about LinkedIn was that they changed their design to be more accessible because of a complaints, sort of campaign organised on Twitter, which was inaccessible, which I thought was fantastic. People who have higher paying jobs work with computers. And you're right, people are now expecting our lives to be online. And if you want to not disclose a particular impairment, you have to curate your online life in a whole different way. Having said that, I also think that although there are sites that are inaccessible, LinkedIn, did change. It is becoming accessible, and that's a great change. You can put up your own, you can put up your own website. Facebook is now much more accessible. I'd love to live in a world where I could say that I'm sure employers won't look at people's Facebook profiles, but I don't live in that world. So I think that some of these mainstream, that three-layer sort of development I was talking about, we are coming around with lots of these very mainstream online platforms becoming more accessible. And I think that that's beneficial. I mean, and it's good that they are. I mean, it's sort of one of those, yes, it was really rubbish for a while when Facebook, for example, wasn't accessible, and if you wanted a job that required it, it was a particular impairment. So things are getting better, but they are a problem. But also that use of online technology, that presentation of yourself, is an important skill to get high-paying jobs. And people with disability are already statistically in trouble as far as their employment opportunities are concerned. So sort of embracing this and trying to make these changes, I think, is even more important.
Hi, my name is Terry Speak, and I'm a photographer. So what am I doing here? A point. Have you read Snyder and Mitchell's The Cultural Locations of Disability?
No, I haven't.
Recommended, because they talk about a disability industry, that excludes disabled people from actually constructing culture itself. So it's not criticism, it's like something that I've had to actually struggle with, because I've been working with disabled people to take, and see, I'm using the term disabled people in the social model, not people with a disability. The people I've been working with would actually not talk to me if I said with a disability. So, the sort of disability rights people. And in order to struggle with this idea, I was picking up on David really, struggle with this idea that we are interested in accessibility and inclusivity, but that very act itself can exclude disabled people from just being part of the community that will create that culture. That's my first point. I don't know if you've got a reaction to that.
That's an excellent point from my background in sort of trying to talk about the internet using post-colonial theory, the idea of, the subaltern who is unable to speak, and in fact, when other people stand up and speak for them, they stand in the space they would have stood in themselves to speak.
Exactly.
And that is, I agree, a real problem. And as not about us without us, the classic disabilities rights slogan. There is a really important role for people. Well, and here's the thing. I often go to disability conferences and things like that, and people will be, looking at me like, "Well, what's wrong with you?" Or Katie's favourite line, you look normal to me. And for me, I find, I'm here to talk about the internet, and I'm really dyslexic, so actually my impairment really is a real pain when I'm using the internet in a way that perhaps you've been in a wheelchair, it doesn't bother you nearly so much. I mean, that's a horrible analogy to make, but there are. But I don't think that I should be I'm not using the fact that I have dyslexia as a disability to allow me to talk about these things. These are social justice things. So I'm talking about it because I have humanity. I care about other people. And the fact that I care about other people and I'm not necessarily in this context the particular sort of person I'm talking about doesn't mean that I shouldn't be talking about it. I think it can be a real trap, because then you sort of go, okay, well, no, so I'm not campaigning, therefore people don't have access to online technology, therefore they can't be online and they can't organise the sort of campaigns that I can organise because they're not there. I mean, it is that great post-colonial thing, people are they're not, no one speaks for them, no one speaks to them. So I think there is a real role for a translator, but there is that classic thing where we can also be perceived as standing in the way. And I struggle with it a bit.
And liminality is always unstable.
Yes.
Of course, Oliver, was it David? Oliver actually talks about this as an emancipatory research, in that who says that disabled people have the skills and the will to do the research themselves. I just park that, so you can kind of balance it to some extent. So let's go back to that social model of disability. You heard Shakespeare. There's a wonderful paper. Tom Shakespeare is actually in Australia at the moment, and there's a paper accusing him of not being disabled because he's criticised the social model by saying that it is essentially limiting. Because if you, I'm going to the other side of the argument now, if you persist with the idea of society disabling disabled people and you win, you will have no support. Society will not give you accessibility because you've won your argument. So politically, it doesn't stand up.
I can understand how you can make that, all those little jumps of logic. Little jumps of logic.
Well,
that's a horrible way of describing it. But yeah, it is. I mean, I think that the social model and its politicisation has played an extremely useful role, and I think continues to play an extremely useful role in just as a way of people being able to talk about disability and to talk about struggle for people with disability to have access to the rest of society. And it's interesting. Like, I'd really like to embrace Fiona Campbell-Curie's ableism, but it's often, when I'm talking about it, it's just a step too far. When you start talking about, and I suppose that gets back to that idea of, talking about people with a disability. If you start saying, well, that's a very ableist assumption to someone, they look at you like, the language is a little bit they're not ready yet, I suppose is the way I would describe it. And I hope one day we will. We'll be able to go, oh, that's a very ableist assumption of you, and people know exactly what you're talking about. But right now, I think that the sort of the social model of disability and the sort of collective anger that sort of supposed to channel is still the most useful way forward.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Di Griffiths from the Institute for Educational Cybernetics. I'm very curious about this American guidelines whose number I can't remember, beginning with a W. WCAG, yeah, I can't. And how that has become instantiated in Blackboard, and then Blackboard are using that as a means of gaining access to the market, and how that relates to
they're bloody clever, aren't they?
How that relates to no talk about us without us, because it seems to me that's moving the whole thing into a kind of surrogate discussion, which is not actually about disability, but which is about monetizing the discussion about disability.
Yeah.
The web content accessibility guidelines 1.0 and 2.0 are developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of done under the auspices of Tim Berners-Lee. Mm-hmm. The standard that Blackboard was able to obtain was awarded by the American Federation for the Blind. Now, they are quite savvy operators, so they will go to a company like Target or Kmart, I think, and say, your website's inaccessible and we're going to go after you with the various accessibility legislation. So they are a proactive organisation. So Blackboard would have gone to them and worked with them to get that certification. Now, they would have done that for, I'm sure, more selfish reasons than to do the right thing. But that's okay, because the legislation is designed to allow corporations to be selfish and for other factors to make sure that there are good social outcomes. I think it's much better to have that sort of mechanism in place than to assume that an organisation like Blackboard, which has, I'd say a monopoly, but at least is part of a duopoly on learning management systems, they are not going to change on their own. We were talking earlier in the questions about the idea of sort of universities opening up to people with disabilities because we want to have more consumers. That's been, the idea that people will make things accessible for people with disabilities because then they'll be able to consume their product is a nice economic one, but one that very rarely I find in practice actually happens. It requires legislative and social pressure before change occurs.
So you're telling me that the world will be a better place because of this, and that the one-size-fits-all approach and the distance of Blackboard as a corporation from the realities of the people who are using their software doesn't matter?
I'll take what I can get, and what I got was accessibility for people who are blind, and that makes the world a better place, yes. It's not the best place, but a better place. Baby steps, I think, are the way to go in this particular. This is a long fight, not a quick battle.
It sounds very Jedi Knight, Mike. Tara Brabson, Professor of Creative Media, and last question, I think. And my question is about class. And it's also about a question about the University of Bolton that all of us live in, and we're very grateful that you've come and joined us today. I had a first-year paper that's due today and tomorrow, and a lad pulled a page out of an exercise book and wrote a URL on it, and I had to remind him to write his name with a pencil on this piece of paper. And I said to him, Philip, why didn't you type this? Why is it on a piece of exercise paper like this? And he said, because I don't have a printer. So I wonder how questions of class manifest and map over the e-learning, social injustice, colonial, subaltern narrative arc that you've constructed today. Where are you now on class and disability and e-learning?
No, well, that's an excellent question, and I'm going to struggle to answer it. I'm going to struggle because it encompasses a number of individual areas. So when I was first doing my doctoral research, and I've written about it subsequently, the idea of, you know, the digital subaltern, someone who is not online, people who are online can't see them. They can't see what's online and don't know what they're missing out on. They are sort of a very elegant example of a particular type of underclass. And when we talk about e-learning, those people completely fall outside of of anyone we're able to deal with, which I think is terrible. You know, now there will be a significant proportion of people with disability who fall within that digital subaltern label. But it is a broader class issue, and it is part of, and it is unfortunate that people with disability, in terms of socioeconomic status, perhaps not class, trend down. So they're going to be overrepresented in that group, and that is an additional struggle, and it's an additional struggle for universities and for society in general.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to listen to Mike. Can you please thank him?